This video discusses the killing of children and a suspected murder-suicide. So if this topic is too heavy for you, especially if you're autistic, disabled, a survivor of family violence, or a parent under stress, please take care of yourself. Pause, step away, reach out for support if you need it. Welcome, my stars of Orion. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Orion Kelly, that autistic guy. I'm all about providing validation and support for autistic people and their loved ones. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to do that on this video. But sometimes you just got to stand up for what you think's right. Let's start with a short factual context so you know exactly what we're talking about. I'm going to stick to what's been reported by police and major outlets. So in Perth's western suburb of Mossman Park, emergency services were called to a home after a person known to the family, described in multiple reports as a carer arriving for an appointment, became concerned and contacted police. Now, police located 4 family members deceased inside their house, 2 parents and 2 teenage boys. Police said the family members were found in different parts of the home. Reports also say that family pets, 2 dogs and a cat, were found dead. Police stated early on that the incident did not appear to be violent and that no weapon appeared to have been used. A note or notes were reportedly found, but police have not disclosed the contents at the time of recording this. Police also said that the children had significant health challenges and that the family had engaged with care services, but details were not made public. Now, other media reports and later pieces included claims and commentary around disability labels, what support looked like, and what the parents were allegedly experiencing. And that's exactly where this discussion matters. How quickly a public narrative gets built and what that narrative does to autistic people, or more broadly, disabled people. Bottom line, we need to talk about something incredibly serious. The way some media and communities talk about a tragedy like this, especially when autistic kids are involved. It can unintentionally increase harm, not because people are bad, but because language shapes what people accept as thinkable. What I'm actually talking about is high-risk framing. I'm not here to debate grief. I'm not here to police feelings. I'm not here to deny that parenting can be hard. I'm here to talk about framing. High-risk framing is when a story is told in a way that pulls the audience to sympathize with the person who caused the harm, makes the harm sound understandable or inevitable, and blurs the moral line between struggle and violence. That blurring is what I mean by moral softening. And it matters because research into suicide reporting shows that certain kinds of narratives can increase risk across a population through social learning and identification. Here's the key idea. A story can be emotionally sincere and still be public health risky. Now, that's not an insult to anyone's grief. It's just reality. When audiences repeatedly consume narratives that frame lethal harm as a tragic last resort, it can lower the psychological barrier for people already distressed. It's an option people take. Normalize harmful associations. So disability equals unbearable. Children equals burden. Violence equals relief. And shift community empathy away from victims and onto the person who caused the harm, even when nobody intends that. Here's a simple definition. Moral softening is when language reduces how wrong something feels. Not by saying it's okay, but by quietly changing the emotional and moral meaning. And it usually shows up in a few predictable ways. So the moral softening checklist, if you hear any of these patterns, just pause. Neutralizing verbs, words like died, lost, were found dead can sometimes hide agency. Sometimes those words are necessary. But in a case like this, they can blur the central truth. 2 children were killed. Equalizing language, phrases like double tragedy, can make the harm feel evenly shared. But harm isn't evenly shared when autistic children are killed. Grief can be shared, harm is not. Inevitable language, so no other choice. Breaking point, this is what happens when. That's the language of inevitability. And inevitability is one of the biggest moral softeners. Another one, perpetrator-first storytelling. So if the first emotional center of the story is the parent's suffering or the parent's reputation, the children become secondary. That's a red flag. Another one, disability as a rationale. So the moment the story becomes because autism, because severe needs, because they were too hard, you've created a cultural script where disability becomes relevant to whether someone gets to live or not. Now, I'm going to do something practical. I'm going to show you how easy this is to miss. Risky example. A devastated family pushed too far. Now, what that does, it suggests a line exists where child killing becomes understandable. Say, for example, 2 children were killed. The community is devastated. That's the same grief, but there's a clear boundary. Example number 2, a risky example. A family suicide. Now, what that implies is a shared agency, shared consent. Say, for example, suspected murder-suicide involving 2 children. A third risky example. They had no other choice. Now, what that does is that turns violence into inevitability. A safer option could be they may have felt desperate. Violence against children is never justified. See, you can acknowledge distress without turning it into permission. Let's talk about the risk narrative people slide into. They were at breaking point. The system failed them. They had no other choice. It was a family tragedy. They were loving parents who did everything they could. Now, let me be crystal clear. Systems can fail, and families can be under enormous pressure. But the moment the story becomes understandable, we're quietly changing the moral meaning of what happened. Because 2 children did not pass away. 2 autistic children were killed. When we frame the killing as the tragic endpoint of caregiver suffering, we risk teaching society something very deadly. That killing children can be a sad solution to stress. That can never become normalized, not even subtly, not even unintentionally. And here's why this matters. Once a community starts telling the story as good people pushed too far, you can feel the moral boundary soften in real time. Look at the kinds of praise that actually appear in the reporting. I'm going to quote them because they show how quickly the narrative centers the parents as admirable, almost heroic figures. A support worker described the parents as the boys' biggest, fiercest supporters and wrote about the consistent dedication and deep love they showed. Another line said the parents never stopped fighting for their children to feel seen and heard. And a friend of the father described him like this: absolute legend, most honest bloke I've ever known, caring, thought-provoking, adventurous, loving, stand-up, best of mates. Now, I'm not saying those people didn't believe what they said. I'm not questioning their feelings. I'm simply saying when those quotes become the emotional center of the story shifts. See, it becomes easier for the public to slide from 2 autistic children were killed into, well, this was an understandable outcome of love and struggle. And that exact slide is what high-risk framing looks like. This narrative is sticky because it's emotionally tidy. It gives people a way to cope. If they were good people, then it wasn't evil. It was desperation. But that coping mechanism has a cost. It can erase victims. It can make autistic children feel like extensions of parents rather than separate human beings with rights. And for autistic adults watching, and even disabled survivors of family violence, this can land like a warning. If the world describes your existence as too hard for others, your safety becomes conditional. That's not theory, that's how stigma works. I'd like to offer a framework that stops this conversation from becoming polarized, because people tend to split into two camps. One camp talks only about systems and stress, and the other camp talks only about harm and responsibility. But we actually need two truths at the same time. Truth one, systems can fail families. Support can be inaccessible. Stress can be crushing. That's real. And truth two, autistic children's lives are not negotiable. And violence against autistic children is never an understandable outcome of stress. That's also real. The danger is when we merge them into one story. Because when we merge them, you get something like support failed them, therefore this happened. And that therefore is where moral softening lives. You can advocate for better support without turning violence into an implied outcome. You can fight for respite, services, crisis pathways, while still saying this was harm, this was wrong. Children deserved safety. Words do moral accounting. Family suicide can subtly imply shared consent, shared agency, shared responsibility, even when that isn't true. But children were killed is unambiguous. It protects the boundary. Autistic children are not collateral. This is huge. No other choice doesn't just express grief. It implies inevitability. It implies justification. The truth is, there are always other choices, even if they're messy, imperfect, and hard to access. And notice, this phrase isn't hypothetical. In the tributes and commentary, you see versions of it, like made to feel they had no other choice, and were at breaking point. This is exactly the kind of framing that can transform a crime into a tragic solution. Even if the intent is compassion, the effect can be dangerous. Softener number 3, turning the note into reasoning. So when reporting leans into notes as explanations, it can shift the story from 2 autistic children were killed to here's why the parents did it. That's a dangerous narrative pivot because it centers the perpetrator's mindset and invites the audience into that. Even neutral details like instructions about finance or warnings on a door can start to build a coherent storyline. So they planned, they thought it through, they were rational. That can accidentally increase identification for people who are distressed and looking for a script. That's why many safety frameworks discourage turning perpetrator communications into public meaning making. The autistic children were too difficult, too severe. This is where disability stigma gets weaponized, even when nobody intends it. So when autistic kids are described as too hard, too much, too difficult, it tells the world that autistic kids are a burden, and that burden is relevant to their right to live. That framing harms autistic people everywhere, especially those who grew up in homes where adults treated them as problems to manage. This one matters because it doesn't just affect this case. It teaches a cultural lesson. Autism becomes framed as a family catastrophe. High support needs become framed as unlivable. And autistic kids become framed as costs, not children. That's how society becomes less safe for autistic people. Through story patterns, not just laws. Softener number 5, rest in peace together as a family. Yeah, I know that might sound kind. I know it's grief, but man, it's smoothing over the moral reality. 2 autistic children were killed. When we wrap the whole story in togetherness, we risk erasing the victims as separate people. A victim-centered alternative could sound like they deserved safety. They deserved futures. They deserved protection. Not together as a family, because togetherness is not neutral when the story includes autistic children being murdered. Because when society starts treating autistic kids as problems to manage, it becomes easier to treat their lives as optional. So I want to be clear. These 2 autistic children had futures. They were not diagnoses. They were not burdens. They were not reasons. And any time we tell the story in a way that makes their death sound like the tragic endpoint of someone else's suffering, we erase them. If you're autistic, especially if you grew up feeling like you were too much, I need you to hear this. Your existence is not a burden. You matter. You deserve safety. Let's explore the empathy problem and talk about the phrase, holding empathy does not endorse harm. Privately, in your own heart, you can hold complicated feelings. Humans are complicated. But public empathy, expressed in certain ways, can absolutely function like endorsement, because it changes how the act is socially understood. If the empathy centers the perpetrator's suffering, suggests inevitability, frames the killings as understandable, or softens moral language, then it doesn't matter what you intend. It changes the story other people learn from. Here's a simple test. If the empathy you're expressing makes someone say, I can see why they did that, then you've crossed from compassion into moral softening. You can have empathy for struggle and still say, that struggle does not translate into permission to harm or murder autistic children. That's the boundary. But what about the NDIS, the support cuts, the system failures? We can definitely talk about systems. We should talk about systems. But there is a safe way and a risky way. So the risky way would be, this happened because supports were cut. This is what happens when you don't help families. They were forced. So that's building a causal justification story around killing autistic children. Clearly the better way is systems must improve so families get support without ever implying that violence becomes understandable. We can demand better services while keeping the moral line clear. Autistic children's lives are not negotiable. You can fight for policy change and refuse moral softening at the same time. That's the whole point. Here's the trap. Advocacy language can unintentionally become motive language. So when people say, this is what happens when support gets cut, it can sound like violence is a predictable outcome. And once something is framed as predictable, it starts to feel excusable. We can demand better support by saying families deserve help before crisis. Respite and supports reduce stress. We need systems that work without ever suggesting, and therefore, killing autistic children makes sense. Because if we blur that line, we don't just influence policy debates, we influence what the public sees as understandable. A simple way to advocate for better support without building a justification story. 3-step framework. Step 1, name the harm. Clearly, 2 children were killed. Step 2, name the prevention goal. We need accessible supports, respite, crisis options, and pathways for families to get help early. And step 3, reject the justification link. Support gaps can increase stress. They do not make violence understandable. That's the ethical structure. Because the alternative structure, the risky one, goes like this. Support failed Therefore, this happened. And that, therefore, becomes a cultural permission slip. We can absolutely demand better services, but we do it with moral clarity, not motive storytelling. And in general terms, here are some safer framing choices you can use anywhere. In comments, posts, conversations, media. You can say, support systems must improve. Advocacy. You can say, no struggle ever justifies violence. There's a boundary there. You can say, if you're overwhelmed, you deserve help. Reach out today. You want to avoid things like no other choice, understandable, complex, as a substitute for moral clarity, family suicide. They were too difficult. And you should certainly avoid any narrative that centers the perpetrator's pain more than the autistic children's humanity. Autistic children are not burdens. Disabled children are not reasons. They're children. They have a right to be safe. And the way we tell stories about these events either protects that truth or slowly corrodes it. That's where the focus belongs. Their humanity, their right to safety, and the moral clarity that violence against autistic children is never a solution. And I also need to say this clearly. When autistic kids are involved, harmful framing spreads faster and cuts deeper because autistic people already live under a stereotype that we're hard, burdensome, too much, expensive, exhausting. So when a case like this is publicly narrated as severe autism, too difficult, the system failed, no other choice, it doesn't just tell a story about one family. It teaches a cultural lesson that autistic lives come with an asterisk. And autistic adults, we feel that immediately. And parents feel it too, because it quietly tells them that in the worst moment, violence might be seen as tragic rather than unacceptable. So I want to draw the boundary again. Autism is not the story. Support gaps are not the story. The story is 2 children were killed, and that can never be softened. And we can fight for better supports without sacrificing that boundary.